Welcome to the Virtual Study Constitution and Responsibility, going into American Nicholas and evolving Executive Director. He's also your continuer here, O'Brien.
Programming here at for the study of the April in the year 16. It is to be with you today. The weather is beautiful, mountains clear, rather chilly, and part of what makes it seem is the fact warm. And my brother more pretty good of snow, and today something in the area of 3 to 5 inches as well. So winter's kind of it was pretty good while we would get through it, but now it seems to want to leave, or it's resisting this a little bit. Again, it's pleasant and to another week of programming here at the Virtual Center. And again, I thank you for your continued support for the program and for the Head On Radio Network. I was chatting with Bob Kincaid before we went on the air, and of course, as many of you know, Bob is scheduled to do double duty this week. He's doing 2 programs. 1 hour, 2 hours. All of will that and things to keep this program on the air. I just think it's incredible, and I'm so grateful. We'd like to hear from you. If you'd like to be on the air and share your thoughts, your ideas, your concerns, suggestions about some issues we brought here. We'd hear from you. Let me not quickly on them first. There's 6637447. Email address to Brian90 Gmail. That's all one word. .com. And finally, try always to do over our Facebook page. If you are a regular, you go to the homepage, and in the search at the top, type, and you will our Facebook page. I have these weeks and months, a number of pieces there. So your input, I have not on there last week. I intended to put something on there over the weekend, but various you didn't come in time. I'm going to try to open today with something pretty, and I think in a form, really like to and get your reaction center this and pull together. I've had the piece, the transition from problem to solution, the transition in political parties from the attitude until early 9th century were a negative problem, and it did become, as Richard Hofstadter, the system. That's what I was working on. I thought I'd be posting something on a weekend, but I really didn't push it. So I'd like to introduce it to hear from it, Facebook page. So, if you do find that you would like a copy, I'll put it on over today. Again, you can type in the virtual to this page. The way it works as latest material is at the beginning. And as you go further and further down, you're getting into the older and older material, so to speak. In other words, as you post new things, they become the most recent things, and you just work through Facebook that way. We've been doing an awful lot in previous weeks with political parties. I don't know that we've done nearly enough. What I hope to do today, I've kind of threatened this 3 or 4 different times, is to get into George Washington's farewell address a little bit, and do it principally within the context of parties. But what I'd like to do at the beginning, in the first portion of our program at least, is address this question of political parties and the nature of political parties by sharing with you some of the things that I've written. Then what I would like to do, hopefully, if we get into it in our second hour, is look at Washington's farewell address in some depth. It obviously can be looked at. In fact, I think I made reference to it in this piece that I've written, which I'll share with you in a moment. You can look at it from the perspective of political parties, but I would suggest to you that's only a part of it. I think that's one particular way of looking at Washington's farewell address. I don't know that it's the best way, as it were. And what I mean by that is it works, given the fact that we're looking at the issue of political parties in America. But on the other hand, I think the address is one of those standalone major documents that we hear so much about. And the only way to be able to assess whether, in fact, that is a valid categorization of the farewell address is to look at the entire thing. So that's what I would like to do. There's quite a bit in it about foreign policy, for example. And I'm not doing anything with that right now, but in this particular issue of parties. But I think when we get to it in the address itself, I think we'll focus a little bit on the question of foreign policy as it's addressed in that piece. I find it interesting. We've been on the air almost 10 minutes right now, and I haven't mentioned the election or whatever. Everybody knows, of course, tomorrow is the Wisconsin primary. It seems to be shaping up as a major event in this year's primary season on both sides of the aisle. There's some suggestion, the polls are indicating that Bernie Sanders has a very, very good chance in Wisconsin. And if he is successful, and if he wins Wisconsin substantially by a significant margin, that's many people think will be a motivator as we move into future primaries coming in New York and in Pennsylvania and other places. And of course, as we know, the turmoil in the Republican Party continues. I'm reading article after article in various outlets about the destruction, the effective destruction or deconstruction of the Republican Party as a result of this political campaign. The appearances that Donald Trump made over the weekend, he was pushing very hard for John Kasich to drop out of the race. His position is that Kasich was taking his votes, not Cruz's votes, his votes. And so I was talking to somebody earlier this morning who made the comment and said, if indeed the Republican primary, presidential race does indeed go into an open primary, it could be that John Kasich is sitting in the best place of all, because in an open primary, people are going to be looking for a candidate that they can all coalesce around. That just might be John Kasich. So we'll see. And the interesting thing is the polls indicate that Kasich would give either Hillary or Bernie Sanders a really good run for the presidency, whereas Trump and Cruz would not. So in nominating one of the two leaders, the Republicans, if the polls are correct, are signing their own death warrant, so to speak, as far as chances of winning the White House. The issue is how much more they might lose in the process. Unbelievable election season, it seems to me. In fact, I think when we get into this issue of two parties a little bit later, I think we'll be kind of into a little bit about this political election, this year's election as well. With that, then, let me share with you, and a lot of this is, I'm going to read some of the things that I've written, and hopefully at places I can pause where necessary and try to add a little commentary or a little clarity to what I'm saying. And of course, one of the reasons I like to do this is because when I hear it, sometimes things that I thought were very clear, I realize when I hear it, were not clear. And it gives me an opportunity to make corrections as well. So, as I mentioned, I've entitled this Political Parties, the Transition from Problem to Solution. And some of this is material that we've covered, especially the two pieces that I'm going to be referring to by James Madison. So I don't think we'll need to spend a lot of time on those. In January of 1792, under the very nose of the most popular president ever, much of modern two-party politics in America seems to have been born. As I read that sentence, it dawns on me, and I just thought that it's worth a mention, although I didn't put it in the piece because there are space considerations in what I'm writing. But I thought of it, and I wanted to make mention of it right now. And this is that I think it's important to realize that George Washington is the President of the United States. He's the unanimous choice. He's everybody's choice for president. He's the most popular president ever in the history of the country. Yet it's in his administration that political parties emerge and indeed blossom. The reason I mention that is because the position that we'll see in in his farewell address, which I remind you again was written by Alexander Hamilton. The position argued in Washington's farewell address is that in a free nation where the people in open elections elected their government, then there's only one thing that citizens can do, and that is to support the policies of government, support their government, because it's a popularly elected government. It's their government. And with regular elections scheduled, there's always the possibility to turn out that government and elect a different one if for some reason people don't like what the government is doing. What is missing totally from Washington's farewell address is the concept of a loyal opposition. The idea that there are always going to be people who disagree. The way the farewell address is written, Hamilton makes it very clear that there's no room in his frame of reference for dissent. To dissent against the people's government that is governing in the name of the people is treason. And the only heresy, treason, and the only logical thing to do for these people is to leave. In other words, there's one official point of view, there's one set of policies, and in theory, in a Republican government, the purpose of citizens, once they are able to elect their government, is to support it and to support their policies. End of story. Madison questions that. And Madison's basic position is that there will always be parties. And the logic of that position on Madison's part, logic tells you that if there will always be parties, then you got to do something to accommodate them. And our two-party system, it becomes that accommodation. So I think the opening line, the opening sentence in this piece is significant in that it raises the question that parties emerged under Washington's administration. The most popular president ever. I guess what I would say is if parties emerged in Washington's administration, then it tends to cause one to accept Madison's position that if there wasn't unity in the country behind the Washington administration, there'll never be unity behind another, because he was the most popular, he was unanimously elected. So I think it's significant that all of this is happening while Washington is president, because it seems to validate Madison's argument that parties are inevitable. In fact, he says that in what he writes, and I will quote that later on in this piece. So that's the first sentence. Basically, what I'm suggesting is that much of what we now know as America's two-party system began in the Washington administration as early as January of 1792. On the 23rd day of that month, the National Gazette ran what just might be the most informative recipe ever written to make Republican government work. Its author, James Madison. Its theme, to spell out a strategy for government, to shield republicanism from efforts by the rich and well-born to wrest control of American politics from the people. So Madison's article in January, the 23rd day of January, 1792, the overall theme is Madison's strategy for republicanism in the face of efforts by the wealth and those traditionally in power to seize political power from the people and in the process destroy the Republican form of government by putting power back in the hands of hands that these people believe should never have lost it, should always have it. So that's the issue. This is Madison speaking in his January 1792 piece. Parties are unavoidable, Madison asserted. Government's job, if it is successfully to combat this evil, is to implement a series of positive steps to so manage self-interest in politics as to deny wealth and inherited position its traditional dominance. Madison's formula is as follows, and this is the 5-step recipe or formula that we looked at, I believe, in a program last week, and I'll just touch upon it rather quickly. Step 1, establish political equality among all. Treat everybody equally before the law, no exceptions. Step 2, withhold unnecessary opportunities. This is a quote from Madison. Withhold unnecessary opportunities from a few to increase the inequality of property by an immoderate and especially an unmerited accumulation of riches. Madison's point there, obviously, is the rich, the wealthy do not need help. They do not need any additional services from government. Therefore, government's job, if republicanism is going to work, is to make sure that the few, the people who don't need help, get it. They don't get it. That's the key. Deny wealth the perks that exacerbate inequalities that already exist in a free society. Step 3, very unobtrusively, that's my word, not Madison's, but the next couple of lines are Madison's. Very unobtrusively, and that's my translation of Madison's opening line, by the silent operation of laws. Reduce extreme wealth towards a state of mediocrity and raise extreme indigence toward a state of comfort. The way I would reword that or explain that, promote positive policies to moderate the distribution of wealth by applying downward pressure on the top and raising those at the bottom to a state of comfort, all without violating the rights of property. In other words, to put that into perhaps more understandable language, Madison's strategy, if republicanism is going to work, it absolutely requires that government not allow inequality to become too broad, too much of a power. In a free society, Madison believes, inequality is always going to be there. There's always going to be the few and there's always going to be the many. But while inequality is there, it needs to be managed if republicanism is going to work. Therefore, government has to do everything that it can do to push down from the top and up from the bottom in such a way that inequality is minimized. And as I believe I said it when we covered this a while ago here at the Virtual Center, I believe that inequality being minimized is one thing. But the most important thing is that people believe that inequality is being minimized. People believe that government is working consciously to control inequality and make sure that everybody in this society has a fair chance. In the real world, that may not be true. But ideally, it needs to appear to be true. And I think that's an important distinction, but it's a distinction nonetheless. Step 4 in Madison's formula: abstain from measures which operate differently on different interests and appear to give preferential treatment to some over others. Treat everybody the same. Don't favor certain interests at the expense of other interests. And of course, we know that in the background here is Hamilton's financial program, which is a clear example of government favoring certain interests at the expense of other interests. The banking and finance community of the nation, the eastern mercantile community of the large cities in the Northeast, at the expense of the plantation South, at the expense of the emerging West. So in a sense, Madison's fourth step here, abstaining from measures which operate differently on different interests, that in Madison's mind is a key one, because that's what indeed he sees the Hamilton program doing. And step 5, Madison recommends implement the strategy laid out in Federalist Number 10, making one party a check on the other. And the way I've put that into explanatory language, turn the inevitable negative of parties into the positive equilibrium created by counterbalancing self-interest. Those steps, Madison says in his January 1792 piece in the National Gazette, are the steps that government must take in order to guarantee that Republican government can survive. Because it's always going to be under attack. It's always going to be under pressure from the few. Those who traditionally made all the decisions and who believe that they and only they are the ones who are best qualified to make all of those decisions. So therefore, they have a vested interest in doing all they can to undermine republicanism. Madison's strategy: government must counter that opposition by following the steps that he has outlined. And then the last sentence in the particular paragraph which lists that formula, Madison says the following: if this is not the language of reason, it is that of republicanism. I have bolded that sentence. I think that sentence is incredibly important. If this is not the language of reason, it is that of republicanism. And then I've taken to try to elaborate on that sentence and why I believe it's significant. Madison acknowledges here that Republican government can require actions that confound logic and common sense. What we're forced to do may not always make sense, he admits. But if the future of Republican government itself is on the line, it is, to cite a modern cliche, what it is. We do what we must do. And then there's a quote from Federalist Number 39. Madison said, it is evident no other form than republicanism would be reconcilable with the genius of the people of America, Madison wrote in Federalist number 39, or with the fundamental principles of the revolution, unquote. Madison is saying here, as he did, as he said in Federalist 39, the people fought a war for independence in order to establish a republican government. It's all they know, it's all they want, it's all they believe in. And it's government's job to do everything that it can do to preserve it. And that's what Madison has addressed in this particular article. This is me talking. There is little here to distinguish this James Madison from the author of Federalist number 10. Idealist, political philosopher, and visionary. What has changed, however, is that in 1792, he writes from a decidedly political as well as ideological perspective. As a delegate from Virginia in the nation's first Congress, as well as author of the nation's Constitution. He writes in opposition to specific policies of the Washington administration, Hamilton's financial recommendations, that he believes will destroy the nation by disrupting the sensitive sectional and class balances the Constitution has created. The political Madison isn't that visible yet, but rest assured, he's there. 8 months later, September 22nd, 1792, Madison followed up on his ostensibly apolitical recipe for Republican success with disturbing evidence that little was working as planned. Here, the political Madison surfaced. In a candid state of parties, he sketched a rather desperate picture of a young nation struggling mightily against evil, against the wiles of a wealthy cabal willing to risk everything the Constitution had achieved for its own self-interest. This group, Madison wrote, consists of those, this is a quote, consists of those who are more partial to the opulent than to the other classes of society, and debauch themselves, and I put in parentheses seduced, because that when Madison says they debauch themselves, that means they seduce themselves. They convince themselves to believe that mankind are incapable of governing themselves. These men, Madison says, are convinced that government can be carried on only by the pageantry of rank, the influence of money and emoluments, and the terror of military force. Their ultimate goal? To persuade the many that, quote, government itself may by degrees be narrowed into fewer hands and approximated to a hereditary form, unquote. The result? The Constitution's demise, and with it, popular government in America. The other division, Madison explained, is comprised of those who believe in man's ability to govern himself, who find distasteful the arrogance that seems always to come with rank and wealth. Their mission? To save republicanism. These men, Madison says, are naturally offended at every public measure that does not appeal to the understanding and to the general interests of the community, or that is not strictly conformable to the principles and conducive to the preservation of Republican government, unquote. At this point, I felt it necessary to clarify the difference between the two articles. Madison's candid state, the second one, appears devoid of idealism. It reeks of politics. His strategy to defend republicanism is to paint its opponents as a threat to all the nation holds dear. The same good guy, bad guy scenario, so reminiscent of his political success earlier, affixing the label of anti-federalist to the Constitution's opponents. And at the time, we focused on that. In other words, calling opponents of the Constitution anti-federalists, and thereby claiming the word federalist for themselves, when in fact they were really the nationalists, was a political move that was shrewd. Most historians admit. Madison was extremely clever. When you are able to paint your opponents as anti-anything, that gives you an advantage. So what Madison is doing here, he's labeling the rich and wealthy anti-Republicans, basically implying from the title, from the very name, that these people are out to destroy the vision and the ideals and the principles on which this nation is based. Madison is making the case that they are enemies to the nation in what they are doing. Madison's operative assumption, of course, is that party is faction, an organized interest group contrary to the common good. The term applies always to others, never to your own. In other words, one of the things that I think is classic here is that Madison is very, very quick to identify his opponents as a party. But he does not describe the Republican opposition forming in Congress as a party. These are the good guys struggling to beat off the bad guys. That's the strategy that Madison adopts. In 1796, Alexander Hamilton would respond in kind when he crafted President Washington's farewell address. Ascribing total responsibility for threats to the nation to the emerging Republican opposition Madison was spearheading in Congress. In other words, as we'll see in Washington's farewell address, Hamilton labels the Republican opposition to his programs, to the Washington administration, as a party. So what we see here is the same thing. Each side calls the other one a party, but does not consider the fact that it too is a party. The reason for that is that each one is committed to labeling the other one as an enemy to the success or to the future of the nation. Since there's no recognition of something like a loyal opposition or a legitimate opposition, since there's no recognition of the right of two parties to exist and to compete with each other, then the only alternative left is to deny that you are a party, but make the case that your opponents are. And that's what Madison does in 1792, and that's what Hamilton does when he responds in Washington's farewell address in 1796, and we'll see that when we get to it. Richard Hofstadter, in his classic The Idea of a Party System, took Madison to task for not seeing the potential of parties as solutions to these real-life divisions and threats. It's so fascinating to me that Madison in Federalist number 10 saw that the way you handle factions is by balancing one against the other. The ambition versus ambition phrase, which he used in Federalist number 51. Madison is convinced that the only way to handle factions which are sown into the nature of man is to use some to check others. And by using faction against faction, check against check, you create a sense of equilibrium. The word that some people use is equipoise. You create stasis. In other words, you create a situation where neither side can have its way unless they talk, unless they are willing to discuss, to deliberate, to negotiate, to compromise. That's the ticket in Madison's Federalist number 10. But there's no evidence up to this point that Madison is willing to take that theory from 1788 and apply it to the situation the country finds itself in 1792. And for that, Richard Hofstadter takes Madison to task. He's critical of Madison because Madison doesn't seem capable of seeing the logical transfer of the check and balances principle in the Constitution to the emergence of parties in the real political world. Hofstadter writes, envisaging parties as limited, homogeneous, fiercely aggressive special interests, the parties themselves might become, let me go back. Hofstadter writes, envisaging parties as limited, homogeneous, fiercely aggressive special interests.
The Miata really is
Madison
the
failed
most
to see.
pure, elemental, simple, straightforward sports car you can get. Second and third
Madison
generation, they're kind of evolutions of the one
that
before.
the parties
The
themselves
fourth generation is so
might
radically
become
aesthetically
great,
different in terms
bland,
of just look at the design.
developing coalitions,
it's shockingly beautiful.
eschewing
Major
the
improvement of the
assertion of
MX-5
firm
is the weight
principles and
reduction.
ideologies,
In terms of reducing weight for the
embracing the
MX-5,
muffling
we basically
and
have
muffling the
a strategy
struggles of
called the
special
Graham
interests,
strategy. The Graham strategy
or
says
that
look
they
at
might
everything
forge the
on the
coalitions
car.
of majorities
Today is an
that are in
important
fact
test for the new
necessary to
Mazda
effective
MX-5
government
Miata. For more than
into
2
forces
decades,
sufficiently
we've pushed the
benign
limits of engineering
to avoid
by creating
tyranny
all our
and
MX-5s with near
sufficiently
perfect
vulnerable to
50-50
be
balance,
displaced in
front to
time
rear. And
by the
that's with a
opposing
driver behind
coalition. In other words, what Hofstadter is criticizing Madison for is his seeming inability to see the application of the principle he does so much to explain and defend in the Federalist Papers. He fails to see its application in the real world of politics. And the fact of the matter is, most historians apparently agree, because I haven't seen evidence of anyone, any historian, taking issue with Richard Hofstadter's conclusion or criticism of Madison. In other words, there's no historian that I've seen that makes the argument that Madison himself saw the weakness of the constitutional system in the absence of organized political parties. What I am suggesting in this paper is that criticism of Madison is unfair, and that in fact Madison did envision it, did foresee it as early as 1792, and that's kind of what I'm setting out to prove as we move towards the end of this paper. So after this Hofstadter criticism of what Madison didn't see, then I made the point and said, it is here, with each side hurling accusations of disloyalty and treason at the other, that the logic of legitimate opposition seemed to hit home in America. Bolingbroke, Edmund Burke, and David Hume had all recommended it, the idea of a loyal opposition. But few in America, Madison included, took them seriously until the realities of party politics under the Constitution demanded its serious consideration. But it's here as well that one must again credit James Madison with the last laugh. Because Madison envisioned the framework for contemporary two-party politics in America long before others did. The lapse in insight that Hofstadter and those who followed him attributed to Madison was misplaced. Madison saw within the Republican opposition prospects and a framework for what would follow. National parties as described so eloquently by Richard Hofstadter. He closed his candid state of parties as follows, and this is Madison's next to last paragraph. The Republican Party, as it may be termed, Madison said, conscious that the mass of people in every part of the Union, in every state, and of every occupation, must at bottom be with them, both in interest and sentiment, will naturally find their account in burying all antecedent questions, in banishing every other distinction than that between enemies and friends to Republican government, and in promoting a general harmony among the latter, wherever residing or however employed. In other words, Madison, in this paragraph, this closing paragraph, in his September 1792 piece, envisioned the idea that the Republican majority, the Republican Party, was going to be able to fashion a compromise to link people together by getting people to put aside their differences and unite for the common purpose of winning back the government, winning back control of the government for republicanism. It seems to me that what we have here in Madison is the vision of what will become two-party politics in America. The logic that each side is out to destroy the nation, and your side is the only thing that stands in the way, seems to be but one step removed from the idea of the principle of loyal opposition. The idea of two permanent parties that every 4 years get together and rally around a candidate and a set of platform positions in order to compete for President of the United States, to compete for the votes of the American people. And so the principle of compromise, deliberation, and negotiation that Madison believed in so eloquently in the Constitution is not possible in society at large, in the nation's politics, until there's a mechanism to make it happen. That mechanism is the two-party system and Madison foresees it. I would contend that Madison saw parties at this point as the missing element in the Constitution of the United States. There's nothing in the Constitution that mentions parties. But the absence of such an idea in the Constitution leads to somebody like Hamilton saying, the people elected this government, we're enacting legislation, the only obligation of the people is to support it. There's no room for their opposition to it. Madison, among others, but especially Madison, recognized that that is an impossible thing to demand. In a free society that values free speech and free press, there is going to be disagreement. There's going to be dissent. And if you insist that dissenters are enemies to their own nation, then Republican government cannot survive. What you have to do is legitimize that dissent. You've got to contain it within the system so that you don't drive citizens out of the system and force them to become enemies to their own government. And so the entire mechanism of two-party politics in America, which emerges principally in the period of Andrew Jackson, is envisioned here in the mind of James Madison in the early 1790s, I believe. And from all that I've read, I don't think I've ever read anyone that is willing to give Madison credit for that. It has always been my belief. The more one reads and appreciates the depth of Madison's mind, it becomes impossible to believe that he didn't see this. I was reading historian after historian through the years that was basically saying that there was nothing in Madison, that Madison had changed. He had ceased to be the ideologue of the 80s, and he had become pure Southern politician from Virginia in the 90s. And that he had sold out his own ideology, his own philosophy. And I've seen other people deny that, but say Madison's position was always freedom for individuals, always human liberty. And he never varied from that. And that was the most important code of honor, as it were. That to Madison was the most important thing, was to preserve man's freedom. And no matter which of these periods you look at, he's constantly doing that. He's endorsing or so taking the position that seems to be most in favor of man's freedom. And so therefore, Madison is not a turncoat or is not being two-faced. So that debate has gone on. I've read it. But all through it, I kept thinking to myself, Madison's thinking is too deep. His vision is too precise to have missed this. He missed it in the Constitution. But when the nation appears to be on the verge of being torn apart in the 1790s with parties, it stands to reason that he would be the first one to begin to speculate on solutions. And this document, this letter that he wrote in the National Gazette on September 23rd, 1792, seems to have the paragraph which validates that vision. I'm kind of encouraged by it. So how does one bring, I spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out how to end this. How do you bring this whole thing to a conclusion? What do you say? Well, the thing that it seems to me most people would be most interested in is, does this story have any value in today's world? What does this treatment of Madison on parties have to do with our current political situation? What does it tell us? Or what doesn't it tell us? When you look at what's happening in today's political situation, especially the presidential campaigns that are going on, it seems to be clear to me that there's darn little evidence of Madison's principles or Madison's vision happening. Indeed, in today's world, deliberation, negotiation, and compromise are swear words. Political leaders take every opportunity in the world to put them down. It seems. Those who are willing to reach across the aisle and work with their opponents seem to be fewer and fewer in numbers, or at least less and less visible. The priority in politics today doesn't seem to be finding points of common interest or common ground, as it were, with your opponents. Today's political priorities seem to be on finding ways to bury your political opponents. Willingness to compromise and negotiate is not seen as a political strength, but as a political weakness. So what then is the link between this story about James Madison and the political world we live in? This is the concluding paragraph that I came up with. I'd be interested in your thoughts. It's difficult in today's tumultuous political environment even to imagine the scenario Madison projects here, or to realize that for much of the nation's history, America's two parties did indeed function pretty much according to script. Our parties today are more polarized, dedicated mostly to ideological purity. Candidates see compromise as heresy, discussion as uncertainty, negotiation as weakness. What Madison seems to value most is in hasty retreat. One needs not search far to locate a major cause. The emotional, non-negotiable litany of issues on which our candidates base their appeal to voters. Madison knew that inflexible, line-in-the-sand issues, where total agreement was the only option, where there was no room for compromise, nothing to deliberate, had no business in the political debate. These issues could only divide, never unite. In fact, it seems to me that the difference between our politics today and the two-party system that emerged in this early period with Madison and evolved through the 19th and most of the 20th century worked. It did indeed produce compromise. It did indeed promote negotiation. Our history tells us that when one party loses an election and the other party takes over, usually the party that wins does not set out to decimate the other. Rarely does a party, once it reaches office, set out to undo everything that the other party did. Until now. Now we hear Ted Cruz, for example, saying that on the very first day of office, he's in office as president, he will terminate every word of the Affordable Care Act. He will terminate the Iran deal. He will begin to look carefully at opportunities to reduce, if not eliminate, several federal agencies of government. In other words, the candidates running for president today do not promise us compromise and stability. They promise us turmoil. In this government, that cannot prevail. It cannot survive. It can only destroy the government that the founders created for us. I think this is an incredibly important issue. I hope in what I've written, I've been able to capture a little bit of it. I'll do the best I can to put it on Facebook this evening and give everybody an opportunity to read it. And I do invite you to criticize it, comment on it, call during tomorrow's program about it, whatever you choose to do. I would love to hear from you, and I thank you for it. We've reached the top of the hour. It's 1 minute after 2 in the East. And we're going to pause, take our 5-minute break as we usually do in our regular programs on Mondays and Wednesdays. And in 5 minutes, we'll be back, and then we'll start to look very, very carefully at the issues of the farewell address. Please stay with us. Be right back. Thanks, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to our second hour here at the Virtual Center on this Monday, the 4th day of April in the year 2016. If you are just joining us, welcome to today's program. If you have been with us through the entire program, all through our first hour, I want to thank you for staying with us through that break. If you did stay with us, you really listened to some great music, and I want to tell you how much I appreciate it. If you were here for the better part of the first hour and decided to hang in there, then that says a lot. I'll do the very best I can to fulfill your expectations. I hope I can do that. We do invite you to share your thoughts, and especially with the piece, the first hour focused principally on a piece that I've written that I intend to put on Facebook for your reaction. And hopefully, if I don't get anything too negative, I'll think about maybe submitting it to the Charleston Gazette and see if they believe that others might enjoy reading this particular position opinion paper as well. Again, so I do solicit your input, your ideas or reactions. If you have one, I would love to hear it. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to drop me an email and share your thoughts that way, my address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. And I encourage you to look at our Facebook page. Just go to Facebook, and in the search box, type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will have access to our Facebook page. On it this evening will be the paper that we just looked at during our first hour. So that'll give you an opportunity to look at it a little bit more carefully if you choose to, especially if you're thinking about making some specific comments on what's in there. So again, that's the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution in the search box on Facebook, and that'll take you directly to our Facebook page. I made reference in that piece that we looked at in the first hour to Washington's farewell address, and I've mentioned it several times. And obviously the point that I was making in that piece was that there's absolutely no way to deny that, in part at least, a significant intent behind Washington's farewell address was political. It was Alexander Hamilton challenging the legitimacy of the Republican opposition emerging in Congress. And without naming names, it was a criticism specifically of James Madison for heading up that Republican opposition. That's not all there is to the farewell address, as we'll see. But there's no question that that's a major part of it. Hamilton believes that the future of the nation rests on the working out of his financial program, his funding and assumption, and the creation of the bank, and the idea of a protective tariff, and those elements of Hamilton's program, which are clearly divisional, they clearly divide, they're clearly sectional. They benefit certain people and certain sections of the country at the expense of others. Hamilton's position, of course, is that they fulfill a need that this nation must meet if it is going to become a great nation. Hamilton believes that great nations, by definition, are self-sufficient nations. And the new American nation under the Constitution is not self-sufficient because it's woefully deficient in manufacturing and finance. And there's no question, there's a reason for that. Mother England did everything that it could do to discourage those aspects of American development which would compete with her rather than support the needs of the empire. Southern agriculture, the shipping of agriculture and raw materials from the New World to England, fit perfectly into the worldview of contemporary, at that time, contemporary mercantilism. But for the colonies to presume the right to manufacture, to process raw materials for themselves, to create jobs that ought to go to workers in the mother country, England believed was counterproductive. And so consequently, British policy discouraged it. Hamilton's position then in 1790 is that if the United States is really going to become great, it's going to do so only when it becomes more self-sufficient. And that means that it must make up for deficiencies. And the major deficiencies are in manufacturing and are located principally in the Northeast. And so Hamilton's programs are directed there. But his rationale would be, and indeed in other things he wrote he made perfectly clear, the long-term plan would be that everybody would eventually benefit. Once the objectives of his program were fulfilled, then America would be a great and self-sufficient nation. And its full potential could be realized. So that's the debate which really gives rise to the emergence of parties during the Washington administration. I don't think there's any question that the emergence of the Republican Party opposition that begins in the 1790s is born in opposition to Hamilton's programs. And Madison is spearheading that effort. And he is writing in 1792 in the articles we looked at in the first hour. He is writing as the person who created the Constitution, yes. But he's also writing as a Virginian, as a representative of Virginia. He's also writing as a member of Congress. And he sees the political potential of organizing, of uniting the opposition that is emerging to Hamilton's program. So there's absolutely no question that the political aspect of Washington's farewell address, which again is written by Hamilton, is aimed at the political realities in the country at the time. Hamilton's fire is directed at the Republican opposition. So again, that's not the whole story of what's in the farewell address, but it explains an awful lot of it, it seems to me. Washington's farewell address, issued in 1796, is Washington's message to the nation, telling the people that he has made the decision to not run for re-election to a third term. And he's basically saying that in the present situation, in the present circumstances of our country, he says, you will not disapprove my determination to retire. And in other words, Washington's position is that I've done, I believe, what you brought me here, what you called me here to do. It's done. It's accomplished. And I'm here to tell you that I do plan to retire. And then he goes on and talks about the benefits that have resulted to the country from the things he's been able to do and the services he's been able to deliver. And he says at one point, the constancy of your support was the essential prop of the efforts and a guarantee of the plans by which they were effected. In other words, if I have been able to do anything positively, it's because I've had your support. And I thank you. And then he says, here perhaps I ought to stop. But a solicitude for your welfare, which cannot end but with my life, and the apprehension of danger natural to that solicitude, urge me on an occasion like the present to offer to your solemn contemplation and to recommend to your frequent review some sentiments which are the result of much reflection. Translation, Washington says, I really ought to quit here. I thank you for your support. I pledge to you that I have fulfilled everything that I think I came here to do. It's time to go, and I'm going to go. End of story. And Washington says, I guess I ought to stop here. But I'm not going to. Because there are things I need to share with you. Things that I think that you need to solemnly contemplate about what's happening in this country. These, he says, will be offered to you with the more freedom as you can only see in them the disinterested warnings of a parting friend. In other words, some of the things I'm going to tell you, only I can tell you. Because I'm leaving. I have no skin in this game anymore. Therefore, I don't have a political axe to grind. This is coming to you from somebody that you have supported, somebody who loves you. It's coming from my heart. The fact of the matter is, of course, it's coming from the pen of Alexander Hamilton. And this part that follows Washington's statement that maybe I ought to stop here is the part that prompts Hamilton to write this in the first place. It's a golden opportunity to send a message to the people of America about the dangers of the Republican Party opposition forming in Congress, and to do it in Washington's name. What a coup, if you think about it. So I'm going to try to keep saying Washington says, but bear in mind, it's Hamilton, but it's Washington's address. So theoretically, you got to, to be fair, you've got to assign it to Washington because he signed off on it. So in a sense, he bought it. He owns it, even if Hamilton wrote it. So I guess the question that one might ask is how much of what's in it did Washington really understand and support? By signing off on it, he basically bought the package. And so I guess the question is, to what extent does Hamilton's thinking conform to that of Washington? Apparently, more than we've thought in the past. Washington opens now with his advice to the people by saying, and I'm going to include the language, interwoven as is the love of liberty with every ligament of your hearts. No recommendation of mine is necessary to fortify or confirm the attachment that I have for you and that I have for this country. Then he opens up on an important theme. The unity of government. The sense of togetherness, the sense of community, the sense of patriotism that exists in America, Washington is saying, is critical. The unity of government which constitutes you one people is also now dear to you. It is justly so, for it is a main pillar in the edifice of your real independence, the support of your tranquility at home, your peace abroad, of your safety, of your prosperity, of that very liberty which you so highly prize. But as it is easy to foresee that, from different causes and from different quarters, much pains will be taken, many artifices employed, to weaken in your minds the conviction of this truth. What Washington is talking about here is that there is a major threat afoot to divide the nation. And what Washington is doing is countering that by promoting its unity. He's in essence preparing the American people for what he sees coming, which is an effort to divide the nation and to downplay the importance of unity. In a sense, what you could say is that Hamilton here is getting out in front of the opposition, of his opposition. He's anticipating the strategies that the opposing party would use to undermine the Federalist agenda. And he's countering it with a stress on the need for the unity of the nation, that everybody stays together under one government and everybody becomes the same American citizens. If I can, I'd like to pause here for a moment. I was going to do it later, but I think maybe the most appropriate place is here. And basically take time to address this issue of unity, that we are all one nation under the Constitution. That, as you know, as you recall, was one of the key factors in ratification of the Constitution. That was one of the key goals of the Constitution, was to centralize power and to build unity among all the different peoples and sections of the nation for the new government. And that's what's being promoted here. It's important to recognize that dividing the nation was always a threat. This is a theme, this is an issue that we have barely dealt with in the weeks and months, years actually, that we've been doing these programs at the Virtual Center. And that is on the unity of the nation as a nation. As we know, there were three authors to the Federalist Papers: Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay. We also know that John Jay was a very distant third in the number of Federalist Papers written. I think Jay may have written 6 or 7 at most. Most of his dealt with foreign policy. The idea of the Federalist Papers to the people of New York was conceived by Alexander Hamilton. John Jay was an attorney in New York. It seems to me that the friendship, if you will, between Hamilton and John Jay probably had something to do with Hamilton asking Jay to contribute to the Federalist effort. I think it is very significant that John Jay's contributions are at the very beginning of the Federalist Papers. Specifically, John Jay writes Federalist number 3, Federalist number 4, and Federalist number 5. And they deal with foreign policy. And let me expand that a little bit. I've got those 3 in my hand, but there are more. John Jay writes Federalist number 2 as well. So what I'm saying is, it is important, it seems to me, to acknowledge, to recognize that the whole Federalist effort, which is going to end up with 85 separate papers, beyond number 1, which was Hamilton's introduction to the series, the first issue dealt with is an international one, is foreign policy. And that responsibility is assigned to John Jay. Jay writes the first few Federalist papers, and then I believe writes 1 or 2 later on, and that's it. From what I understand, there was some health issues. He had some health issues during this period as well, and was unable to contribute nearly as much as he intended, or as Hamilton believed he would at the beginning. The issue that Jay addresses at the very beginning of the Federalist Papers is the dangers that the new nation faces from foreign influence and foreign power. The nation's need to be united in order to be respected by the other nations of the world. I guess what I'm saying is it's important to recognize that being the first issue that the Federalist Papers address, I think is significant. And there's a reason. And the reason is that there are a number of leading anti-Federalists, opponents of the Constitution, who begin to advertise, begin to publicize an alternative to the Constitution, which would be kind of a compromise midway position between the Articles of Confederation and the new Constitution. These Federalist leaders argue, many of them argue, that there is a real basis for worry about the power of the central government under the proposed Constitution. Yet there is also a recognition on the part of many of these same people that state sovereignty under the Articles of Confederation can no longer work either. So what they begin to promote is the idea of regional unions, regional confederacies. They begin to talk about a northern confederacy, a southern confederacy, a western confederacy. And what they are talking about, what they begin to emphasize, are the real regional differences that exist within this country. And maybe the best way to go to reform the Articles of Confederation is not all the way towards a national government under the Constitution. Maybe what we can do is create regional confederacies which more accurately reflect the priorities of those particular regions, north, south, and west. And so what many of these people begin to put out, and there's quite a bit of literature on this, is the idea of regional confederacies linked together by some constitutional arrangement, some framework similar to the Articles of Confederation. In other words, a league of confederacies. The reason I mention this is because at the time, this scares the hell out of the Federalists. They realize, they know that the Constitution of the United States that was drafted and adopted at the Constitutional Convention and sent out to the states for ratification, they know that its purpose goes way beyond the organizational structure. The things that they believe the Constitution will fix will all be lost if this regional confederacy idea grabs hold. So they set out to bury this sucker before it has a chance to take even a second breath. I think it's significant that the very first articles in the Federalist Papers series are addressed to the fact that this is one nation, we are one people, we're all in it together, and we all benefit from each other, even though we have differences, regional differences amongst us. The interdependence of some of us on others of us is a strength. And we don't want to forfeit that. We don't want to take a chance on sacrificing that. So I think that it's very significant that John Jay's first 4 Federalist Papers deal with what we would look like to other nations of the world if we were to divide ourselves into regional confederacies and deny ourselves the respect that only a unified nation could ever hope to receive. John Jay, in Federalist number 3, opening paragraph, opening sentence, says the following: It is not a new observation that the people of any country, parentheses, if like the American, intelligent and well informed, seldom adopt and steadily persevere for many years in an erroneous opinion respecting their interests. That consideration naturally tends to create great respect for the high opinion which the people of America have so long and uniformly entertained of the importance of their continuing firmly united under one federal government, vested with sufficient powers for all general and national purposes. We are under the Constitution, when the Constitution is adopted, what we must be. And then he goes through the issues, the benefits of this. The first issue he raises is safety. That's the only way we can be strong and therefore protect ourselves. The second issue talks about how susceptible we would be to foreign armies and foreign influence from dangers that might arise not only outside the country, but inside the country, because there would be loyalties to some of these countries within America itself. We've got to stay united, Jay is saying. And that's really the theme of the first number of Federalist Papers. John Jay says in number 3, it is of high importance to the peace of America that she observe the laws of nations toward all of these powers. And to me it appears evident that this will be more perfectly and punctually done by one national government than it could be either by 13 separate states or by 3 or 4 distinct confederacies. John Jay is addressing straight up the challenge of a regional confederacy alternative to the Constitution. Beside this paragraph, I checked it off as one that I probably ought to share with you. When once an efficient national government is established, Jay writes, the best men in the country will not only consent to serve, but also will generally be appointed to manage it. For although town or country or other contracted influence may place men in state assemblies or senates or courts of justice or executive departments, yet more general and extensive reputation for talents and other qualifications will be necessary to recommend men to offices under the national government, especially as it will have the widest field of choice and never experience that want of proper persons, which is not uncommon in some of the states. In other words, by remaining united, the national government gains access to all the talent in the nation. We're sure to get the very best. You can't be sure of that when you're looking only at states or when you're looking at only regions. Then he talks about the courts being able to interpret law on a national basis and how regional groups could not work. In Federalist number 4, John Jay continues the same issue. In this one, he goes into England, France, and Spain and speculates how each of those nations would treat us if we were regionally divided rather than united. He begins with England's the competition for the fisheries and points out that the only way we have a chance of securing access to the North Atlantic fisheries is if we remain strong in negotiation. If we allow ourselves to be carved up and not unified, we don't have a chance in dealing with these other nations. He says in Federalist number 4, one government can collect and avail itself of the talents and experience of the ablest men in whatever part of the Union they may be found. It can move on uniform principles of policy. It can harmonize, assimilate, and protect the several parts and members, and extend the benefits of its foresight and precautions to each. In the formulation of treaties, it will regard the interest of the whole and the particular interests of the parts as connected with that of the whole. It can apply the resources and power of the whole to the defense of any particular part, and that more easily and expeditiously than state governments or separate confederacies could possibly do. It can place the militia under one plan of discipline, and by putting their officers in a proper line of subordination to the chief magistrate, will, as it were, consolidate them into one corps, and thereby render them more efficient than if divided into 13 or into 3 or 4 distinct independent companies. And he does that from the perspective of what we could expect from our major competitors, France, England, and Spain. I wanted to share especially number 5 with you, which is the same theme written by John Jay. So the important thing to keep in mind is Federalist Papers number 2, 3, 4, and 5 deal with how foreign nations will treat us and view us, and why we must remain united in order to be taken seriously by competitor nations. Jay opens number 5 with a following letter from Queen Anne, dated July 1st, 1706. And it speaks directly to the issues that Jay's been writing about. He says in Federalist number 5, Queen Anne, in her letter of the 1st July, 1706, to the Scotch Parliament, makes some observations on the importance of the union then forming between England and Scotland, which merit our attention. I shall present the public with one or two extracts from it. Quote, "An entire and perfect union will be the solid foundation of lasting peace. It will secure your religion, liberty, and property. Remove the animosities amongst yourselves, and the jealousies and differences betwixt our two kingdoms. It must increase your strength, riches, and trade. And by this union, the whole island, being joined in affection and free from all apprehensions of different interest, will be enabled to resist all of its enemies. We most earnestly recommend to you calmness and unanimity in this great and weighty affair, that the union may be brought to a happy conclusion, being the only effectual way to secure our present and future happiness, and disappoint the designs of our and your enemies, who will doubtless on this occasion use their utmost endeavors to prevent or delay this union," unquote. That's Queen Anne on the proposed union between England and Scotland. And of course, we know that when England tried to include Ireland in that, it caused a tremendous war, civil war that has just basically been resolved recently. Why go back to 1787 and the first 4 Federalist Papers written by John Jay on the unity of all nations? And my point was to make it clear that there's a history here. There was a threat, a real threat. Some anti-federalists were believing that the only way to defeat the Constitution is by coming up with an alternative which will satisfy people that aren't sure. And the Federalists knew that anything short of the whole enchilada, the whole Constitution, would be a defeat they could never recover from. It's that sentiment, it seems to me, that causes Hamilton to emphasize that same kind of unity at the outset of the farewell address that he writes for President Washington. The unity of government, which constitutes you one people, is now dear to you. A main pillar in the edifice of your real independence. But he says, it is easy to foresee that from different causes and from different quarters, much pains will be taken, many artifices employed, to weaken your minds, in your minds, the conviction of this truth. In other words, there are going to be people who are going to try to poison your minds about the need for unity. And of course, what he's leading to here is the emerging Republican opposition. But by 96, it's not just within Congress anymore. It's emerging all over the country, in the form of debates, public meetings, and now the issue of England and France being back at war has caused the two parties to split over support of England versus support of France, and caused President Washington to issue his famous neutrality proclamation in that war. So what Hamilton is doing here at the very beginning of the farewell address is dealing with the issue of party as divisive, as dividing a nation whose strength and future depends on it remaining together, remaining united. Remember, no thought as yet to the idea of a two-party system with built-in compromise and negotiation and all of that. That's not in the cards at all. Hamilton goes on, Washington goes on. As this is the point in your political fortress against which the batteries of internal and external enemies will be most constantly and actively directed. It is of infinite moment that you should properly estimate the immense value of your national union to your collective and individual happiness, that you should cherish a cordial, habitual, and immovable attachment to it, accustoming yourselves to think and speak of it as the palladium of your political safety and prosperity, watching for its preservation with jealous anxiety, discountenancing whatever may suggest even a suspicion that it can in any event be abandoned, and indignantly frowning upon the first dawnings of every attempt to alienate any portion of our country from the rest, or to enfeeble the sacred ties which now link together the various parts. Hamilton is writing here, Washington is writing here, speaking here, warning the people against the presumptive efforts of a Republican opposition to divide the nation and threaten the unity of all citizens behind their government. What Hamilton is doing is taking the alternative position from Madison, that Madison took in 1792. Hamilton is arguing the idea that in order to remain strong, we must remain united. We must line up behind our government and support it and support its policies. Therefore, we must view anybody or any group that raises questions about our unity or raises supposed advantages of our disunion. We must see them as what they are, which is enemies to this nation. This is really strong stuff. And it's coming, theoretically at least, from President Washington. Hamilton goes on. For this you have every inducement of sympathy and interest. Citizens by birth or choice of a common country, that country has a right to concentrate your affections. The name of American, which belongs to you in your national capacity, must always exalt the pride of patriotism more than any appellation derived from its local discriminations. You may be a Virginian, you may be a Pennsylvanian, you may be a Georgian, but you are an American. We all are. And what Hamilton is saying here is that label of being an American ultimately must be the one that matters to you. With slight shades of difference, he says, you have the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles. You have in a common cause fought and triumphed together. The independence and liberty you possess are the work of joint councils and joint efforts of common dangers, sufferings, and successes. What Hamilton is doing in that paragraph is stressing the commonalities, the things that people throughout the country have in common, not the things that divide them, not the regional differences, but the things that they have in common that make them all Americans. But then he goes on and raises the specter of threat. But these considerations, he says, however powerfully they address themselves to your sensibility, are greatly outweighed by those which apply more immediately to your interest. Here, every portion of our country finds the most commanding motives for carefully guarding and preserving the union of the whole. What Hamilton is going to do here, and we're kind of running out of time. We've got about 4 minutes left before we have to stop. It's 54 minutes after the hour. What Hamilton is doing here is setting up the argument, or the argument that though the nation has many different regions, it is the interdependence of one section on the other that makes the nation strong. It's important to understand that this is not just political rhetoric on Hamilton's part. He really believes this. His whole economic program was based on this idea of economic interdependence as being the basis for the strength of the nation. It's the internal unity that comes from satisfying each other's needs, from one section supporting the needs of another section, all working together to create a whole that is stronger than the parts. In other words, as powerful as every section is, they only maximize their power when they stick together, when they unite. The fact that Hamilton is saying this, the fact that he's got Washington saying this so early in his address, seems to indicate that he believes that the opposing party is going to make the counter argument to this, that is going to suggest the differences between sections that make the need for national support behind one and the same policy agenda unworkable. It's important to, I'll say this because we're at the end of our time. It's 57 minutes after the hour. So let me just make this comment and we'll come back and begin here in our program tomorrow, which, by the way, as you recall, on Tuesdays, our program will begin 1/2 hour later than it did today or than it will on Wednesday. We'll be beginning at 1:30 p.m. tomorrow. The point that I kind of want to make, however, is, well, actually, I lost it. Senior moment at the end of the program. I wanted to emphasize one particular thing about this unity theme, and I forgot what it is. Hopefully, it'll come back to me tomorrow, if not today. I want to thank you. We're at 58 minutes after the hour. I want to thank you for tuning in today. I want to thank you for your patience in letting me go through this article in the first hour. And I do invite you to comment. I'll try as best I can. I'll try to get this thing posted on Facebook this evening and give you an opportunity to see it and react to it. I encourage you to do that. It can only benefit from your comments, I think. I want to thank you for your continued support of the program and for your support of the Head On Radio Network. I want to invite you to join us tomorrow. Remember, we'll be beginning 1/2 hour later tomorrow than today. And we will be spending our program tomorrow on Washington's farewell address. So I know a few of you have told me in emails that you have Googled a copy of Washington's farewell address. You can find it all over the internet. Just type in Washington's farewell address. And you might want to read along with us. You might want to have read before the program tomorrow. And that will give you an opportunity to put a lot of this into context and to react in places where reaction seems to be called for. I know I would appreciate that, and I know our other listeners will as well. I'm going to leave you by saying thank you. I appreciate your attention, your support, your loyalty. I hope that you have a wonderful evening. Be kind to each other, and hopefully we'll all get back together again tomorrow. For the Virtual Center, this is Bill O'Brien saying thank you.